All right, let's get right into it. How on earth does a country that's one of the world's biggest energy exporters ends up barely able to make its own petrol? It sounds kind of crazy, right? Well, it's a huge paradox, and it's a story about choices, decisions made over decades that have left Australia in a really, really vulnerable spot.
I mean, just take a look at these numbers. Back in 2002, Australia had 8 oil refineries dotted around the coast. Today, we're down to just 2. And those last two, look, they're not exactly giants on the world stage. They supply less than 20% of our country's fuel. The rest? It all comes in on ships from somewhere else.
So, yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? That's what we're going to dig into. How did this happen? How did a nation, literally sitting on a gold mine of resources, become so reliant on other countries for the very fuel that keeps everything, and I mean everything, moving? And this is where we get to the heart of the irony, what you could call the exporter's paradox. It's this bizarre loop where we're selling our raw stuff for one price and then buying it back as a finished product for a whole lot more. Wow. Look, the numbers here really tell the story, don't they? We produce a ton of really good, high-quality crude oil. But check this out. A whopping 96% of it gets loaded right onto a tanker and sent overseas. Just a tiny, tiny sliver, 4%, is actually processed right here at home. And this really hammers home that cycle we were just talking about. We sell off our raw energy, the crude oil, the gas, the coal, and then we turn right around and buy back petrol, diesel, jet fuel, the finished product. And get this, it's often from countries like Singapore and South Korea, who might have made it from the very same oil we just sold them. It's wild. So what's the result of all this? The real-world impact? Well, it's a razor-thin safety net. Right now, Australia has just 36 days of petrol in reserve. Now, to give you some context, the international standard, the recommended buffer, is 90 days. We have the lowest reserve of any developed nation that imports oil. That is not a great spot to be in. Okay, so to understand how we got here, we've got to rewind a bit. Australia's refineries, they're mostly from the post-war era. Think the 50s, the 60s. They were built for a totally different world, a much smaller Australia, a simpler global market. But what they didn't know was a new age of giants was just around the corner. And this is where the mismatch in scale just becomes impossible to ignore. A single mega refinery in India, just one, can process over 1.2 million barrels a day. To put that in perspective, that's more than our entire country uses. Meanwhile, even back in their heyday, all of Australia's refineries put together couldn't even hit 500,000 barrels. We were completely outgunned. It wasn't even a fair fight. Right. And it's really important to get this. This didn't happen overnight. There wasn't one big event that shut everything down. It was more like a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, grinding process where a whole bunch of economic pressures just piled on, making it impossible for our smaller, older refineries to keep their heads above water. So what were those cuts? Well, let's break it down. Compared to the massive new refineries in Asia, our plants had higher labor costs, higher energy costs, and tougher environmental rules. Plus, the buildings themselves were getting old. Our ports couldn't handle the new megatankers that save a fortune on shipping. And the cherry on top, the Aussie dollar was super strong during the mining boom, which just made importing fuel even cheaper. It was a perfect storm. And this next quote, it just sums up the whole crazy situation perfectly. You see, most of our oil is actually drilled off the coast of Western Australia, and it got to a point where it was literally cheaper to sell that oil to someone in Singapore than it was to ship it all the way across our own country to Sydney. It sounds nuts, but that was the brutal economic truth. But look, this wasn't just about money. That's only half the story. The other half is about policy, about choices. And this is where Australia really went down a different path from its neighbours, who looked at fuel and didn't just see a business. They saw national security. And you can see that difference crystal clear right here. On one side, you have countries like South Korea and Singapore. They decided fuel self-sufficiency was a national priority. They poured government money into building these huge modern refining hubs. And on the other side, Australia, we took a hands-off, she'll-be-right approach. The belief was the global market will take care of us. So every time our refinery closed, it was just seen as a private business decision, not a red flag for national security. And then COVID hit, and that was the final nail in the coffin. Suddenly, nobody was driving or flying. Fuel demand just fell off a cliff.
For the big multinational oil companies, this was the moment they'd been waiting for, the perfect reason to shut down the last few Aussie plants. It happened so fast. In just a few months, we lost half of our already tiny refining capacity. And by the time the government finally reacted with the subsidy, it was too little too late. The horse had already bolted. And this is the really tough part to swallow. Once you shut down one of these incredibly complex refineries and turn it into just a simple storage tank, that's it. It's over. You can't just flick a switch and turn it back on. It's a one-way street. That door closes and it doesn't open again.
Okay, so let's bring it to the present day, because all those what-if scenarios, all the things experts were warning about for years, well, they're not what-ifs anymore. We're living with the real-world consequences right now.
And it doesn't take much for the whole house of cards to start wobbling. Imagine this. There's a conflict somewhere on the other side of the world, and a major shipping lane gets shut down. Instantly, the price of oil skyrockets. What does that mean for us? Well, suddenly you're paying a fortune at the pump. And even worse, you start driving through country towns and seeing those dreaded signs. Sorry, no diesel.
And that's when it really hits home for everyone. You might think, I don't drive a diesel truck, why should I care? Well, think about this. Every single apple, every carton of milk, every loaf of bread in your supermarket, it got there on a truck. And every one of those trucks runs on diesel. When you have a diesel shortage, the entire system that feeds the country starts to grind to a halt. And you know what that means? Food prices go through the roof.
So what's keeping the lights on? What's stopping us from being 100% dependent on imports? Pretty much one thing, a government subsidy. It's called the Fuel Security Services Payment, and it's basically life support for our last two refineries in Geelong and Lytton. But here's the catch. That lifeline starts to run out in mid-2027. And what happens after that? Honestly, that is a massive unanswered question.
Just to show you how close to the edge we are, let's say the Lytton refinery in Brisbane closes. The entire country, all 27 million people, would be relying on one single plant in Geelong. One. For everything. That's not just risky, that's the very definition of being vulnerable. And I think that brings us to the most important takeaway from all of this. The refineries didn't just vanish because of some unstoppable economic force. It wasn't because Australia couldn't afford them. They closed because for a very, very long time, as a country, we convinced ourselves we just didn't need them. And now, that choice has left one of the richest, most resource-filled nations on Earth crossing its fingers, just hoping that nothing goes wrong on some shipping lane thousands of kilometers away.